Thank you everyone so much for joining us tonight. I'm Margaret Zimmer, an assistant professor in the Earth and Planetary Sciences Department here at UC Santa Cruz, and tonight I will be your moderator. So the UC Santa Cruz University Forum is an ongoing series focusing on the relevance of our research to the community and to the social, economic, environmental, and political issues. This series proudly features the impact of research conducted at UC Santa Cruz. And I want to thank you so much for joining us tonight for our final University Forum for this academic year. Before we begin, I would like to share a few details about the event tonight. So we are using a webinar tool, so there is no chat function. However, we invite all of you to submit your questions into the Q&A box at any time tonight. And we will have an opportunity to answer your questions at the end of the program. One final housekeeping note that I just want to mention is that tonight's event will be recorded. So tonight our speakers will discuss how humans manipulate and depend on rivers for power, water, and transportation. As a result, the historical development of infrastructure in river networks is often intertwined with river evolution, such that the present day shape of a river reflects past land use decisions. However, specific evidence from anthropogenic changes to our rivers is often difficult to recognize because we have very few historical observations of our landscapes. So tonight we'll discuss this conundrum using the local San Lorenzo River as an example. Our speakers bring together high-resolution topographic data, field observations, radiocarbon dating, and historical imagery and paintings in order to travel back in time a few centuries and explore how historical land use is recorded in the rivers draining the Santa Cruz Mountains. So now I want to go ahead and welcome our two speakers for this evening. Dr. Noah Finnegan. He received a BA degree from Carleton College, which is in Northfield, Minnesota, in 1999, and a PhD degree in geological sciences from the University of Washington in Seattle in 2007. He is currently a professor in the Earth and Planetary Sciences Department here at UC Santa Cruz, where he uses geomorphology to study volcanic systems, fire-affected regions, earthquake histories, and river systems. Noah's research and teaching are focused on processes of erosion and sediment transport on hill slopes and in river channels. And prior to joining UC Santa Cruz, he was a postdoctoral associate with the National Center for Earth Surface Dynamics at UC Berkeley. Our other speaker tonight is Will Chapman, who is a fourth-year PhD candidate in the Earth and Planetary Sciences Department here at UC Santa Cruz. And he received his undergraduate degree in geology from Carleton College as well, located in Northfield, Minnesota. His research focuses on how rivers both record and respond to changes in human land use and to climate, as well as the specific sedimentary processes that can explain river behavior. He plans to continue exploring interactions between rivers, humans, and ecosystems in his future work. And with that, I will now turn things over to our two speakers, Noah and Will.
Thanks, Margaret. All right, I'm going to go ahead and share my situation here. Okay. Does that look good? Okay. So thank you, Margaret. Again, sorry, I just want to make sure I'm not muted. Can someone give me a thumbs up?
Yeah, you sound great.
Okay, thanks, Margaret. Okay, so thanks, Margaret, for the introduction. And thank you all for coming out in a virtual way to hear a little bit about the research that we're doing in the local landscape. So the title of the talk, again, is The Legacy of Historical Land Use Recorded in the Rivers of the Santa Cruz Mountains. And again, my name is Noah Finnegan. I'm going to be providing you kind of a 10,000-foot overview to start the talk, and then Will is going to really spend the bulk of the talk telling you about the specifics of what we've done. I like to start this talk with the following picture, which is a lithograph from 1870 of Santa Cruz. And we're looking from the ocean, obviously, back at the town of Santa Cruz. That's the approximate location of UC Santa Cruz. So I'm familiar, there's Beach Hill. You would see the, this would be the roller coaster is right here. Here's the mouth of the San Lorenzo River. And why I like this picture is that there is a lot of detail in this image in terms of the morphology of the landscape, which is kind of what I'm interested in general. But what you might notice immediately is that there's very few trees at this point on the landscape. And this is a real dramatic contrast from how the landscape looks today. And that's one of the things that we really are going to think about, or that's the main thing we're going to think about in the talk today, is how past land use changes that occurred, particularly during the time of intensive forestry in this landscape, are recorded in how the rivers look today, and also how they behave in some pretty important ways. And so Will's going to get into that. I would like to provide you with just use this opportunity to tell you a little bit about why study rivers to begin with, and why, and to help sort of motivate the talk and explain a little bit about the science in a more general way that you're about to hear about. And I think there's sort of there's a lot of different ways to motivate the type of research that we do, but I'll choose a couple examples to try to get us focused in on the questions that Will's going to think about. To begin with, and I'm from the East Coast, so I always like to draw on examples from the East Coast. Rivers provided the first kind of interstate highway system in this country and in many other countries as well. So what's shown here is the eastern seaboard, middle Atlantic region. This is Chesapeake Bay. If we look at the locations of major cities in the central and the middle Atlantic region, there's Trenton, New Jersey, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Washington, D.C., Richmond, Virginia. You can see this is a hillshade, or this is a colored map that's colored according to topographic elevation. That's what we call a digital elevation model. And what you can immediately see here is there's kind of a break between the gray colors and the blue colors. That's something that is called, that feature is called the fall line. And it turns out that all the rivers, when they cross that fall line, go from being navigable to unnavigable. And so many of the cities were developed at exactly that point where the boats could no longer get upstream. And as a consequence, the architecture of the rivers really had a fundamental control on how the cities that were first being developed by European settlers in this area were built. Notably, that feature, this thing, the fall line, actually has a really interesting geologic legacy. I'm just going to sort of help you to see this slope break here. This is actually the shoreline that existed on the east coast of North America during the time when there were dinosaurs still walking around on land, during the Cretaceous period when sea levels were much, much higher than they are at present. And so this is kind of a curiosity, but it really emphasizes the fact that there's a long geologic history that is imprinted on the morphology of the rivers, which in turn is imprinted on the way that cities were developed on the East Coast. So that's an example of why it's interesting and important to understand why rivers behave in the way that they do, and look the way they do. Another example, obvious but important, is that rivers provided the first power plants in this and many other countries. And so when the first sort of European settlers arrived in North America, virtually one of the first things that was typically done was to find a river and dam it, because that was a way to provide power easily. And you could build a mill such as is shown in this example from Raleigh, North Carolina, a middle 18th century mill. What's shown on the left here is a map from a really cool paper by some researchers at Franklin and Marshall College in Pennsylvania, who were explicitly interested in how the legacy of these colonial era mill ponds still influences the way that rivers look and behave in the present day. And this is just a map showing you the locations of historic, in this case, 19th century mill dam locations in 3 counties, Chester, Lancaster, and York County in southeastern Pennsylvania. And this, I like this map because it really emphasizes the fact that virtually every free-flowing section of river was dammed early on in the history of this country. And yet, a lot of times the evidence for that damming is invisible to us at present. And so keeping this historical context in mind is really essential for our understanding of how rivers work. And it's really for these 2 reasons, as well as many others, that we can recognize that our lives, and in particular our infrastructure, are inextricably linked to rivers. Like here's downtown Santa Cruz, just showing you how the city has built up around the banks of the San Lorenzo River. And at times that river is flooded, and indeed there's been a lot of work to try to contain that flooding. But it's really the fact that the shape and position of rivers is constantly changing, which in turn is driven by deposition of sediment and flooding. It's that fact, that inconvenient fact, that is one of the basic reasons we study rivers, right? So this is an image that is derived from laser altimetry taken from an airplane of the Mississippi River floodplain, in this case, just southeast of, or southwest of Memphis, Tennessee. And what I like about this picture is it just shows you that everything about the topography of the floodplain in this location reflects the legacy of this river slowly meandering around on timescales that are much longer than human timescales. And it's the fact that our infrastructure has been built on top of this constantly evolving river system that creates a lot of the tension, which motivates studying rivers, and indeed is one of the reasons the field of civil engineering exists to begin with. This ever-changing nature of rivers is also why rivers are so interesting as a scientific problem. Here's another example of laser altimetry derived floodplain topography, in this case in Louisiana, just again showing you the construction of this floodplain over time by the motion of the river on longer than human timescales. What's really cool scientifically about rivers is that river morphology, which we can define in lots of different ways, let's say the width or the depth or the sinuosity or the slope of a river, that form of the river emerges from the interaction of flowing water and a boundary that can evolve in response to the flow. In other words, the sort of container that is the river emerges from the interaction of the water and the sediment that it's being carried. It's sort of this magical thing that you put water and sediment and in this case vegetation together, and you get this beautiful form that has a constant width and a constant sinuosity that scales with the size of the river. And so this is trying to understand what determines these patterns is one of the most interesting aspects of studying rivers. And from this study, we have developed an understanding that river morphology, again, principally when we talk about river morphology, we mean width, depth, slope, sinuosity. We understand that these things reflect a delicate balance between, on the one hand, the sediment load that a river carries, and on the other, the water that it conveys. In other words, rivers kind of do 2 things. They move sediment and they move water. And we can think of the river existing in kind of a delicate balance between those 2 demands. So this is a famous conceptual diagram from a paper from 1955 called The Design of Stable Channels by Lane. And this conceptual diagram is oft reproduced because it gives us a lot of explanatory power for how rivers work. In this case, we can see sort of this balance with sediment load on one side and water discharge on the other. And we can imagine that if we add water, in other words, we give the river more water relative to the amount of sediment it's moving, we give the river more appetite to move sediment. And if there isn't more sediment being supplied from upstream, the river will satisfy that appetite by mining its own bed of sediment, which will lead to erosion or degradation. So adding water tips the balance towards degradation in this diagram. Conversely, if we add sediment to the picture, and if we quickly add enough sediment that the river is no longer able to move it with the amount of water that it has, we tip the balance towards aggradation, which is another way of just saying that the sediment builds up in one place. So this shifts in this balance in rivers in reality can be natural, but are commonly anthropogenic. And it's these shifts that drive erosion or deposition of sediment and thus channel change. And it's channel change which creates tension with the sort of built infrastructure around rivers and is one of the things that we're kind of very interested in predicting. So let me give you an example. Or one more just view of this problem, just to emphasize the point. This is sort of a figure just kind of trying to give you a view of all the different kinds of river channels that exist. And we see this diversity of forms in rivers, and we understand it as being, related to, for example, the size of sediment the river is carrying or the slope that the river is flowing over. But importantly, we also recognize the amount of sediment that the river is carrying as something that has a fundamental control on the way that the river works, such that we can actually make this sort of connection between process and form in rivers and actually interrogate the form of the river to understand something about things that are happening upstream that might produce sediment or reduce sediment. So let me give you one example to illustrate this point before I hand things off to Will. As a field, we are fortunate to have had a recent natural experiment to sort of illustrate some of the points that I'm trying to make in a more abstract way. Indeed, the largest dam removal in US history recently occurred, began in 2011 on the Elwha River, which is in Washington State. This is the Olympic Peninsula in Washington State, and it's on the kind of northern end of the Olympic Peninsula. Two very large dams, the Elwha Dam and the Glines Canyon Dam, which together impounded over 20 million cubic meters of sediment, were removed in order to allow salmon to get back up into this catchment. The removal of these dams released a huge amount of sediment into this river system and provided us with a really great natural experiment to watch how a river evolves in response to this huge change in the balance in those scales that we were just looking at. So just to orient you, and I should just say that this work that I'm telling you about is work that's been done by a lot of people in Santa Cruz at the US Geological Survey and at the National Marine Fisheries Service, where there are groups of researchers that are really involved in this question of how to manage dam removals. This is from a paper by John Warwick, who's at the USGS in Santa Cruz. Some of you in the audience may well know him. Here, just to sort of make the point more clearly, this is the Glines Canyon Dam, the bigger of the two dams, being taken down in sections between 2011 and 2013. And here is the sediment that was impounded in Lake Mills, which was the reservoir that was created by the construction of the Glines Canyon Dam. And it's that sediment that was released into the river that creates the kind of natural experiment that I'm going to show you. And in particular, there are lots of examples of this, but here's just one where we see the river prior to the dam removal and 2 years right after the dam removal. And you can immediately see changes to the sinuosity of the river, changes to the width of the river. The river actually got much finer, and it went from a single channel to a more braided channel morphology. And so these are all examples of how we can quantitatively measure how changes in a river, both in the form, but more importantly in its behavior, can arise due to, in this case, land use decisions that are happen upstream, but which trigger change that we can see locally. And I should just say that change is not restricted to the river channel itself. Down the coast was also dramatically changed at the mouth of the Elwha River. So here's the mouth of the Elwha River on the Strait of Juan de Fuca in Washington State prior to the dam removal. Here it is shortly after the dam removal, where there's this huge plume of fine sediment being released out into the ocean. And then this is when that slug of coarse material finally reached the coast and created a huge new beach. In other words, there was land construction that occurred on the beach in response to the removal of this dam. And so it's just a good way to sort of get us all oriented in thinking about how river behavior works and how information propagates downstream through river systems, and how rivers integrate information from land use changes or perturbations that are occurring upstream. Okay, so in this talk, we're going to ask not about dams, but rather about forestry, and in particular forest clearing. And we're going to ask how that perturbation to the landscape, which was dramatic in some places, particularly in coastal California, is recorded in the river channels of the Santa Cruz Mountains. And despite the fact that this was relatively recently in history, the clues are difficult for us to glean from the landscape and require a fair amount of creative work, as Will is going to describe to you now. So thanks very much. And Will, you can take it from here.
Awesome. Thanks, Noah. Let me just share my screen. All right. I think this is working. Wonderful. Okay, great. So that was wonderful. That sets us up perfectly to talk about our kind of local case study of how rivers are affected by human land use changes. And so specifically, the example that we're going to be talking about today is the San Lorenzo River. And that's shown on the left here. And this is a photo taken from the bridge in Henry Cowell State Park. This is kind of the river that we're talking about. And just to orient ourselves, this is a map on the right here of the San Lorenzo River watershed within the Santa Cruz Mountains in the Central California coast, because I know this may be a broader than California audience here. But this watershed is the largest drainage in the Santa Cruz Mountains. And just for reference, I've placed a few familiar locations on this map. We have Boulder Creek, Felton, and Henry Cowell State Park, UC Santa Cruz, and then downtown Santa Cruz, basically where that vantage point was from that lithograph that Noah was showing. And that's where the San Lorenzo flows out into Monterey Bay. And so in this talk, we're really going to focus on Henry Cowell State Park, where that photo on the left was taken. So let's just zoom in there really quick. This here is an image from Google Earth showing the northern entrance of Henry Cowell State Park. So up on the left side of this image, upper left side, you have the town of Felton, as well as the park entrance and the bridge going into Henry Cowell State Park. And that comes off of Highway 9, which is shown as that orange line there. And then down on the bottom right is that old growth redwood grove where most of the action happens when you're visiting the park. And then finally, we have the San Lorenzo River, is that white dashed trace there. And one thing that I'd like to draw your attention to is the broad area in the center that's labeled floodplain. And so this is a really flat region directly adjacent to the river. And on the southern end, we have these kind of broad, open, deciduous forests. And then north of there, it's kind of an open meadow. And so there is one problem with this interpretation of this floodplain region, and that's mostly the idea that we expect floodplains to flood every couple of years or so. However, in this area, the San Lorenzo has really overtopped its banks only twice on record. So in the past few decades of flow records that we have, there really hasn't been that much overbank deposition of sediment or flooding onto that floodplain surface. So what's going on here? Well, if you've ever walked along the San Lorenzo River in this area, if you've noticed, the San Lorenzo River itself is actually fairly far below you as you're walking along the trail. So that kind of begs the question, is it possible that the channel is somehow too deep below that floodplain surface now? Just to illustrate this more, this is a photo that's taken just off of one of those trails beside the San Lorenzo River, looking downstream. And so the trail, so the photo on the bottom is where I'd like to draw your attention first. There's a trail that's directly adjacent to the river where those folks are standing to the upper left on that image there. And then the river is off to the right in that image. And so a simplified cross-section is shown just above the photo, and that red trace in the cross-sectional diagram there is also shown roughly in the image below. And so in this spot, the riverbed is about 6 meters or somewhere around 20 feet below the floodplain surface where those folks are standing up there, which certainly seems unnaturally deep, just given the size of the river. And this could certainly explain why the river is no longer inundating its floodplain. It's just too far below the floodplain to actually overtop its banks when you get a large flood. And so, although this is sort of still anecdotal at this point, it certainly is possible that we're looking at a situation where the river cut downward, down from its floodplain surface, or incised, as you can see in this diagram. On the top of this little image here, we have a kind of equilibrium situation where the river is in a normal state. But then over time, the river carves into its bed downward, or incises, and deepens that channel. And so now it would take an enormous flood to actually overtop that bank of the river there and cause any sort of inundation to the floodplain. So that's certainly a possibility of what might have happened here. And if we suspect that could explain why we don't get any flooding on the kind of flat surface in Henry Cowell State Park, the next question is then, what caused that? When did it happen? Is it due to human land use changes, for example, given that we just spent a lot of time talking about that for the first 20 minutes of this talk? There have certainly been some major human disturbances in the San Lorenzo watershed. And like Noah mentioned, one of the most significant ones over the history of Euro-American settlement in California is clear-cut logging of redwoods. And so here's a map on the right side of basically historical logging mills in the San Lorenzo River watershed between 1842, when the first lumber mill was established, and 1975, when this map was first published. So each one of these symbols represents an individual logging mill, and they're colored, and the shapes represent different periods in time that those particular lumber mills were active. So the main takeaway from this map is just that there was a lot of logging in this watershed, and that was pretty obvious from that sketch of Santa Cruz that we looked at earlier. One puzzling thing, though, about this is that some of you might know that typically when you cut down trees in a landscape, a common response is for sediment to enter the stream. There's more erosion, and the stream bed will aggregate or build up sediment. And that's the opposite of what we suspect might have happened with San Lorenzo, where we think the river has cut down. But again, if you recall from Noah's portion of this session here, whether rivers build up or lose sediment it's related to the balance between the sediment that you're giving the stream and the ability of that stream to transport that sediment away. So even if you're giving a lot of sediment to the stream from removing trees, you might be able to counteract that by somehow increasing transport capacity in those ways. And just to jog your memory, here's a little diagram of the scales again, where you have sediment supply on one side and stream power, or the capacity of the river to transport sediment, on the other. So even if you dump a bunch of sediment into the stream, there might be other ways to cause that needle to swing, not from aggradation, but to degradation, if you have other ways of getting rid of that sediment. So there were, in fact, some logging practices that were pretty widespread in California that do have the potential to degrade river channels and possibly overcome that additional sediment input entering the stream. First of all, because rivers were used as major conduits to transport harvested logs downstream when they were clear cutting the landscape, often any natural wood in the channels, large woody debris, is cleared out in order to make that transport easier so that the harvested logs don't get hung up on anything. So, for example, you can imagine situations like in the upper left here, where you have just natural accumulations of old driftwood in the channel from fallen trees from before, not harvested wood necessarily. And so usually they would remove those to make the transport easier, but the process of removing those natural log jams also reduces the amount of friction and turbulence of water on the channel. So you end up having a situation where the water is moving very fast and stripping away sediment on the river bottom. Another common practice throughout the US was something called splash damming, which is shown on the bottom right here in this image from Pennsylvania. And this is a really interesting process where basically large temporary dams were constructed, and any harvested logs were piled up in the water that accumulated behind the dam. And then after some time, the dams were eventually blown up to send the logs downstream in these massive catastrophic log drives. And so that, needless to say, was fairly, or at least has the capacity to be fairly destructive to channel bottom through the direct abrasion of the channel with these logs, and also really high peak floods. Okay, and then finally, loggers also used to skid harvested logs directly in the channels at low flow. And so this would directly abrade the channel bottom as well. So it's worth pointing out at this stage that we don't exactly know specifically which of these methods or others were used in the San Lorenzo watershed. It could be any, all, or none of these, but we do know from other studies nearby that all of these and others were employed just 30 miles north of here in the Pescadero Creek watershed. And there, these practices actually led to multiple meters of incision in that stream. So if you imagine that local example of logging practices that caused incision in Pescadero Creek, and then you remember that we were looking at this lithograph of a completely deforested landscape near Santa Cruz, that all comes together to say that there's probably precedent for logging-driven incision in this region as well. So that brings us to the main motivating questions of this particular section of the talk. First, we want to ask the question, how much exactly has the San Lorenzo River incised, if at all? We haven't proven it yet. Secondly, when did that incision occur? And thirdly, what triggered that incision specifically? Okay, so again, we don't exactly know what the San Lorenzo used to look like in a quote unquote natural state, so we don't really have anything to compare to, but we do have a suspicion that the river cut down recently. So we want to confirm whether this happened and by how much. And so the strategy for figuring out whether there has been incision and how much is fairly simple. There are ways to predict how deep a river channel should be in kind of a natural equilibrium state. And that's based on how water and sediment is moving through the system. Because again, Noah mentioned this in the first half of this talk, but rivers are basically adjusting themselves to move the sediment and water that is supplied to them. And so if we can predict how deep a river should be, given the water and sediment that it carries, we can compare that to how deep it actually is today. And that should give us a sense of how much incision may have happened on the San Lorenzo River. So I'll walk through just two methods that we used for predicting what the quote unquote natural channel depth was. And so the first idea relates to this idea of sediment mobility. So how much water do you need to move the sediment in the channel? And this idea states that the shape of a river channel, including its depth and its width, are going to adjust in order to move the sediment that's carried by the river. And so according to this concept, a river channel is going to evolve to be just deep enough so that when that channel is completely filled with water, the water is going to exert just enough stress on the riverbed to begin moving sediment. And so we followed this line of thinking and determined what flow depth was necessary to move your average grain size in the river. And that particular flow depth represents the predicted natural depth of the channel pre-incision. And then the second idea that I want to touch on is this idea of the formative discharge, which was proposed by Woolman and Miller in 1960. And this second idea is based on the concept that different sized flows in a river transport different amounts of sediment. But those different sorts of flows happen with different frequencies, right? So your everyday flow, for example, is very common, but it doesn't transport that much sediment on any given day, right? On the flip side, when you have massive floods in a river, that transports a ton of sediment, but those floods are very infrequent. So there's some kind of sweet spot or like optimization point where there's a particular sized flow that's transporting the most amount of sediment over time. And that's generally thought to be the kind of most influential type of flood for setting the geometry of that river channel. And this is called the formative discharge. And the thinking goes that the depth of that flood should be the depth of a natural equilibrium channel. So we gathered flow records and sediment data and calculated the depth of that particular flow event. Okay, now I'm going to show you the results of those two methods for predicting the channel depth. And those are shown here in a cross-sectional view of the channel looking downstream. So the floodplain is shown on the upper left there. And I've drawn a little dashed line representing just the channel being completely filled with water, okay? And so each of these two gray regions in the bottom part of the channel represent the range of depths that we calculated to, with regard to those two different theories. So the sediment mobility theory predicted that a natural river depth should be somewhere around 2 meters or so. And that second theory, the formative discharge theory, predicted that the channel should be about 3 or 4 meters above the channel bottom. And so we can then just compare these depths to the actual channel depth needed to fill the channel, which is about 6 meters or so, in order to estimate how much the river has incised. So if we compare the sediment mobility idea with the estimated bankful flood, that suggests there have been about 3 to 4 meters of incision, and then the other model suggests about 2 to 3 meters of incision. So altogether, we're predicting that there has been about 2 to 4 meters or so, which is somewhere between 6 and 13 feet of incision on the San Lorenzo River sometime recently. Okay, just as a quick aside, the fact that this river has incised by somewhere between 2 to 4 meters has really important non-academic significance as well, from both the natural hazard standpoint and ecology perspective. If a channel is too deep for the river to flood onto its floodplain, on one hand, that's decreasing your flood risks. But on the other, if we're just thinking about the hydraulics of a river, it's making the river really channelized, so it's faster and more erosive. And so you can end up having major erosion problems and bank destabilization and that kind of thing, as seen from this photo taken here in Washington State. Also, floodplains are really diverse ecosystems that provide habitat for a number of different aquatic and terrestrial species. For example, salmon and trout species, like the steelhead trout that are shown in this image here, really rely on floodplains for spawning and for juvenile habitat. And in fact, the degradation of river channels throughout California and also like throughout the entire West Coast as a whole is one reason for the decline in these fish populations. So this is all just to say that river incision is a very real issue for multiple reasons. Okay, so back to what we did. Now that we actually know how much the river cut down, we want to know when that happened. So normally, rivers periodically deposit sediment on their floodplain surface when they flood. So if we could figure out the age of the sediments that are on the San Lorenzo floodplain, that would probably tell us when the river was still connected to the floodplain surface. And so that would represent a time before incision or downcutting. I'll be using those terms interchangeably. Anyway, fortunately, there is a lot of charcoal in the floodplain sediments here. And we can use that for radiocarbon dating to get a sense of how old those floodplain sediments are. So with some help from some folks at the US Geological Survey in town here in Santa Cruz, we first extracted a sediment core from the San Lorenzo floodplain right next to the river. And that's shown on the right here with two of our friends from the USGS. Once we had extracted that core, then we picked out some charcoal from the sediment and then sent those samples into the lab for some radiocarbon dating. And we got 10 different radiocarbon dates back from the floodplain sediments. So here's a chart that shows the results of our radiocarbon data. And these are organized by depth on the y-axis. So every single label on the y-axis there is an individual sample of charcoal that we sent in. And then on the x-axis, we just have time increasing toward the present day on the right side of the plot. And so it's worth pointing out here that radiocarbon ages, which are shown as those kind of squiggly lines in green here, are not given as single dates, but are rather given as probability distributions. So I've plotted those probability distributions for these 10 different samples in this space here. And there's also a 95% confidence interval that's represented by the little black brackets below those curves. So if you haven't worked with probability distributions before, you can kind of think of them as sort of like smoothed out histogram, like things that are showing taller peaks where there's a more likely result, or it's more likely to be that age at that location. And so there is a lot of scatter in these results, and that's due to a couple different reasons. But the important thing to remember here is that each one of these samples is giving us a date for when the floodplain was still active, when the river was still depositing sediment onto its floodplain. So the river had not incised at that point. So basically, all we need to do is look for the most recent dates to give us a sense of at least how long the river was still attached to its floodplain and not incised. So we'll look to the right side of this plot, and we can see that our latest dates are sometime in the 17th to 19th centuries or so. And so we can pretty confidently say that the floodplain was at least active until the 1600s and possibly into the 1800s. And incision would have had to have happened sometime after that. And just a quick note before I move on, because this is going to come back up in the next couple of slides. These dates, these last dates that we have for the floodplain being active, occur right before logging began in the mid-1800s. And that's shown as that gray bar here on the right side of this plot. And the darker gray color represents when there was particularly intense logging in the Santa Cruz Mountains. And so I'll address this in a second again, but that temporal connection there is very important. Okay, so just as a takeaway from the second part of this section, we've shown that there have been about 2 to 4 meters of incision that occurred sometime in the last 200 to 400 years. And interestingly, that seems to coincide with a period of logging. So that would support our suspicion that maybe logging drove incision in this area. Okay, so now that we roughly know both the magnitude and time of incision and suspect it could possibly be related to the logging in the region, is there any other evidence for logging as a driver of incision here? Well, as I mentioned earlier, we do have that local example of incision that was driven by particular logging practices like splash damming, wood removal from the channel, direct dragging of logs in the channel at low flow conditions. And those all happened in Pescadero Creek, just 30 miles north of here, and caused really dramatic incision of that stream. And so it seems reasonable to expect that the same sort of techniques would be employed throughout the Santa Cruz Mountains and possibly happened here. And that's certainly the simplest explanation. But there are also some other clues that we can look for to answer this question about whether it's definitely logging that drove incision. One thing that we can do is look at the tributaries or the small streams that are flowing into the San Lorenzo River. And this is because we typically expect a lot of these logging practices that I mentioned, like splash damming, log skidding, wood removal. We expect those to mostly be present in the main stem river, the San Lorenzo River, because that was really the main artery for transporting logs downstream. If you think about the smaller tributaries entering the San Lorenzo, those are probably, or at least some of them were probably really too small to move logs, especially old growth redwoods. So basically, if any logging practices drove incision in this watershed, we'd expect incision to be occurring mostly on the San Lorenzo River and less incision or none at all in the smaller tributaries. So there are several small streams that are flowing into the San Lorenzo River in this particular area around Henry Cowell State Park, where we've observed a lot of incision. And this is a map here of the main, so the San Lorenzo River is shown as that white stripe in the center. And there are a few tributaries labeled that intersect it, like Monte Creek, Shingle Mill, Gold Gulch, etc. Also shown here for reference are the USGS gauging site where we took our flow records and sediment data from. And that's at the entrance to Henry Cowell State Park where the bridge is. And also our coring site is also shown just a couple hundred meters to the south of that. These broad colored regions represent either ancient abandoned floodplain surfaces or the main abandoned floodplain that we're talking about in this talk, which is that big green surface directly adjacent to the river. And so anyway, I went to look at each one of these labeled creeks, hoping to get a bit more clues about the nature of incision on the San Lorenzo. So first impressions, when I looked at these tributaries, I noticed that a few of them were basically overhanging the San Lorenzo River with little waterfalls above the main channel. So this is shown in these two images here. Basically, I've outlined the cross-sectional profile of the river, or of each of these tributaries, is that dashed white line. So that's essentially the land surface with the center of the little channel in the middle. And then also shown with the blue dashes, that's basically a vertical face where whatever water is being carried by those little streams just drops down into the river. That's pretty much a vertical face there. So interestingly, that height of that drop from the bottom of that white dashed line down to the river, to the San Lorenzo River that is, that ranged from about 2 to 4 meters above the San Lorenzo River, which corresponds exactly with the amount of incision that we predicted earlier. And so this suggests that incision did in fact begin on the San Lorenzo River first, and then did not happen on some of these smaller tributaries. And so this ended up leaving those tributary mouths hanging a couple meters above the San Lorenzo River. So to bring it all together, basically the timing of the incision from our radiocarbon dates, the nearby example of logging-driven incision in Pescadero Creek, and then also these hanging tributaries all suggest that it seems like logging practices are the most likely driver of incision on the San Lorenzo River. All right, just to sum up the main points here, our two estimates of that natural state, the equilibrium channel depth, suggest that there have been 2 to 4 meters of recent incision on the San Lorenzo River. And when we took radiocarbon dates of charcoal in the floodplain sediments, that suggested that incision would have had to occur sometime after the 17th to 19th centuries. And with those things, as well as the nearby example of logging in Pescadero and the hanging tributaries, we're fairly confident in saying that logging practices are the most likely drivers of incision in this region, and specifically practices like splash damming, wood removal, and log skidding in the channel, as opposed to simply clear cutting the forest. All right. Just one final thing looking forward. We know the river incised, so now what do we do with that? Is there anything we can or should do about the fact that this river is now incised? Well, it's actually fairly difficult to unincise the river when the incision is this extreme. It's maybe like 18 feet of incision or something, or I guess up to 13 feet of incision. So if we're thinking about whether we can do that, well, it's also, I should say, it's also, even if we could unincise the river, there's a lot of development along the river as well. So people might not actually want the river to be restored in that same way. So if we're thinking about how to improve floodplain habitat for species like trout and salmon, as I mentioned before, maybe restoration back to that original floodplain could be tricky. However, there are actually some locations along the river where it seems like there is a kind of new floodplain that is beginning to form at a lower elevation that matches that lower incised position of the river. And this is visible in that same diagram that I showed earlier, looking downstream here. There's this lower surface that's directly adjacent to the San Lorenzo River, so sandwiched between the river and that upper abandoned floodplain surface. And that's marked with that little incipient floodplain right around here. And in fact, the surface is roughly in line with where we would expect the riverbank to be based on those two methods of predicting channel depth that I mentioned earlier. So it is possible that perhaps given a few decades, this surface could expand further and carve away at that older abandoned floodplain to provide new, much needed habitat for a number of different species that rely on floodplains. All right, so if you're interested in this and want to read more about this kind of material in depth, there was just a paper that was published in March in Earth Surface Processes and Landforms. So I'll leave that here and you can check it out if you're interested. Otherwise, I think that brings us to the question and answer part of this session. Yeah, thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Will and Noah, for your great presentations. Please, if anybody has questions, add them to the Q&A. And I will moderate the next about 30-35 minutes of questions. So we already have a ton of questions in the Q&A. So I'm going to try and organize this discussion a little bit in terms of the organization of the talks. So we'll start with some more general questions that were specifically related to some of these high-level ideas that Noah brought in. And then there has been a lot of debate and conversation in the Q&A about potential other mechanisms or other insights our participants have that can build on some of these ideas that Will and Noah mentioned. So we can have a discussion about that. And then we'll finish up with some forward-thinking questions, thinking about current day processes or how things might look into the future. So let's go ahead and talk some big picture questions. We just had a few come in. So to start us off, what, Will and Noah, what do you think happens to stream ecosystems or to river health if we starve rivers of their sediment from human activities like damming? So essentially, if we're changing the sediment balance, what does that actually mean for river health?
Well, I'll give you a break and take this one. The dam question is one that's been looked at by a lot of people for obvious reasons, because there's a lot of dams. And to some extent, I think the answer depends on what your specific thing is that you're interested in. But one I'm familiar with, which is fish and spawning fish. A common observation downstream of dams is that you get coarsening of the bed. You strip away the fine sediment and you don't replenish that sediment from upstream. And so you get a situation where the bed can become so coarse that it's not usable for spawning habitat by fish. A fish has got to be able to move the sediment on the bed of a river in order to lay its eggs. And if you get past that point, it becomes unusable. So that's an example. And incision is another common response to cutting off sediment, just like Will talked about, and all the sort of complications that come from that, in particular, cutting off floodplain habitat.
Fantastic. Thank you, Noah. Building off of the dam removal conversation, so your example of the Elwha dam removal is really fascinating. It's awesome. We have such a great data set to back up a case study like that. So do you know how long it has taken or may take the system to hit maybe a new steady state post dam removal?
One of my other USGS colleagues, Amy East, who works at the USGS in Santa Cruz, has done an amazing amount of work on the Elwha River response. And one of the biggest surprises that came out of that study was how quickly the river processed that slug of sediment that was bigger than the volume of material from the Mount St. Helens eruption, just pushed it out to the ocean, and the salmon were right back in there. And so the big surprise from that study is it took like 3 months for the river to kind of do a lot of what it was going to do in terms of change, and then it really quickly reestablished an equilibrium. And I think that's a big surprise, because every one of these dam removals is kind of a natural experiment, and we learn huge amounts of information from each one of these. And I think that was probably the biggest surprise from that study, was how quickly it reestablished an equilibrium.
Wow, that is really incredible. It goes to show you that natural processes like water movement have such incredible power and can really change our landscapes quickly. All right, so I think those were some of the higher level questions that came in, but if folks have more ideas that came from what Noah just shared with us, feel free to add to the Q&A. But I want to now transition to talk more about the San Lorenzo River. So I'm going to start with a question that's more near and dear to my heart as a hydrologist. So you talked about how removal of trees by logging influenced the sediment load in rivers. But how do you think the removal of trees on hill slopes changed runoff or water movement over our landscapes?
Yeah, there's definitely, this is something that we address in the paper a little bit. But there has been shown to be major increases in the amount of runoff entering streams when you do clear cut a landscape. In terms of that being the possible driver of incision here, it doesn't seem to be the main factor here, because I think I'm trying to remember the specific numbers, but it's some percent increase, like 20% or something. Do you remember, Noah?
Yeah, it's like, this has been studied in Oregon and Northern California. And generally the increases in runoff are actually pretty modest. And in some ways, the more dramatic effect is during the summer.
Yeah.
The lack of transpiration leads to higher base flows in the summer. And so the effect is kind of more pronounced during the periods of time when there's just not that much flow in the river.
Right.
That's interesting. So often when we think about logging, we're thinking about the impacts from major storms. So it's interesting to hear you say that base flow conditions are something we should be thinking about as well when we're altering the land surface.
Totally.
Okay, so the next question I want to ask from the Q&A is about the pathways of sediment. So you talked a lot about how our land use practices are influencing sediment transport and sediment loading, but where is all the sediment going? Are the Santa Cruz coastlines or beaches now different because of logging in the past, or is the sediment making its way to the beach?
Yeah, so
go ahead, Will.
Oh yeah, well, I was just going to say, like, in this particular case, because downtown Santa Cruz is so developed, it's hard to know exactly where the sediment is. But if there has been this much incision, yeah, it's a reasonable question to say, okay, well, where is that sediment going? But there is a useful example in the Pescadero Creek kind of analog that I talked about. And so they documented, or this particular consulting firm, Balanced Geo, documented that there was a lot of incision upstream, and then there was actually aggradation in the lagoon area. So in the kind of tidal flat near the mouth of the river. So in that case, it seems like that's where most of the sediment went, and then probably out to sea as well. But there's just so much development happening. There isn't like a lagoon as much in downtown Santa Cruz. So I'm not sure what the answer is here, or if we have evidence of it. But yeah, maybe Noah, you have some.
Yeah, I would just again plug our USGS colleagues who do a lot of really good monitoring of the nearshore environment, and they've generated nice data sets that show during really wet winters, 2017, 2019, when there was a lot of erosional action. For anyone who lives in the Santa Cruz Mountains, there are landslides, there are roads being washed out, and there's a lot of sediment being pumped out of the San Lorenzo River at that time. And you can actually see the beaches grading, you can see sediment building out from the mouth of the San Lorenzo River. Surfers know about this because in really big sediment years, there's a break at the mouth of the San Lorenzo River that's not there all the time. So part of it is sort of invisible because it's underwater, but if we have the right tools, we can see that sediment, and it goes out to the Santa Cruz coast, and then it moves south towards Monterey Canyon, and then ultimately goes down to Monterey Canyon. So on longer timescales, the sediment is kind of going into the deep ocean through Monterey Canyon, probably.
Wow, that is fascinating to hear the long flow paths, you could say, of sediment in these watersheds. There was a question about the methodology or how you kind of came to your conclusions. There are actually quite a few questions. So the first one I want to start with is about how you compared your system to other systems. So you did talk about the differences in the main San Lorenzo River channel to the tributaries, but what about other reference streams, maybe of the same size? Do you know of any reference streams of the same size as the San Lorenzo River that you could compare to that maybe didn't have forestry practices? And if so, how do these systems look different? Is the ecology different? Or if not, what does that then say about our landscapes in the Santa Cruz Mountains?
I'll take a stab at this, which is just to say this is an awesome question. And it's a great question, and one that I think plagues our field in general, because, as people that study rivers, what we want to try to do is identify the thing we're interested in and then find two rivers where the thing that we're interested in is different so that we can exactly isolate that. And it's nearly impossible to ever isolate for the thing that you're interested in studying, because so many things are co-varying in nature, and so many things are coupled in ways that we don't understand. So that's a long way of saying it's a great question. And if the analog exists, I don't know where it is, but I'd be really interested to hear about it.
Will, do you happen to know of any analogs?
Not exactly, but I mean, in terms of thinking about how much incision happened, I mean, there are some kind of objective ways to compare between different rivers and how deep the channels are, kind of regardless of the size of the river. The first method that I talked about in terms of our incision estimates is basically looking at the amount of stress that's exerted on the channel beds, and there's kind of a ratio between the stress that's exerted by a bankful flood and the amount of the stress that's actually needed to move grains. And that's been shown to vary drastically depending on where you are in the country. But that's one way that you might be able to kind of more objectively, I guess, compare rivers to each other in that sort of analog sense. So when we did that, the ratio between the bankful to the stress that was being exerted on the grains to the actual stress that you need to move the grains, that ratio was a lot bigger in the San Lorenzo example versus most other rivers on the West Coast. And so that's sort of a non-dimensionalized version that shouldn't really depend on the size of the river itself. So yeah.
Okay, so there sounds like there's some clever ways that we could relate characteristics of rivers, not necessarily in the Santa Cruz Mountains, but even farther away, to allow us to understand differences in reference or non-logged systems and logged systems. So speaking of comparison studies, I thought this was a really interesting insight. So we have people, the great thing about COVID is that we can share these types of forums with people from all over the country. So we got a question, I suspect, from someone on the Northeast, maybe in Vermont. So they asked, in many Northeastern rivers, especially in Vermont, we as in probably foresters, think about sediment loading in two phases. So the first is when logging occurs, there could be sediment deposition. And then the second phase is forest regrowth, and that can potentially produce incision through the mobilization of unconsolidated sediment. So do you think it's possible? Could we take insight from the East Coast of the US and apply it to here?
I mean, yes. I'm from Vermont, so I'm happy to. Or I grew up in part of my life in Vermont, and I think that absolutely the Northeast is instructive also because similar things happen, but earlier in time, and so we can see a landscape that's had more time to reforest, and so I think that's probably the most useful analog is that the Northeast is a couple hundred years ahead of the West Coast in terms of that sort of arc of deforestation and reforestation. And so I do think that that two phases of sort of aggradation and incision is something that is something we thought about a lot, actually. And for us, the nearer example is the Sierran gold mining, where hydraulic mining in the Sierras during the gold rush pumped huge amounts of sediment into rivers, and many of these rivers were documented to go up and then cut back down again as they processed that gold mining debris. And so we did think carefully about this exact question, and through looking at data we didn't show, looking specifically at how the USGS stream gauges behave over decades, you can get a sense for the long-term trajectory of the rivers. And we were pretty confident that the only thing we've seen is a down cutting rather than an initial aggradation and then a down cutting. But the question leaves something we thought really carefully about. And although we can't exactly discount that, it seems like this is just a one-way change that we've witnessed.
Just to elaborate on that a little bit, because I did also see that question in the Q&A, but basically, like, if it were an initial aggradation and then incision, that entire surface that is Henry Cowell State Park would have had to be the product of aggradation, and the amount of sediment that you would need to do that is like astronomical. And then also in some of those hanging tributaries, if it were aggradation and then incision, a couple of those little hanging tributaries actually have bedrock exposed rather than alluvium, and that's really only possible if the river is just like cutting downward through the bedrock as opposed to building up alluvium and then cutting through the alluvium again. So yeah, we're fairly confident that it was just an incision response here.
Okay, thank you so much, both of you. So now I want to turn our discussion to think a little bit more critically about what sounds like your argument for the dominant driver of the shape of the San Lorenzo River channel is logging. But we had a ton of suggestions and questions related to potential other drivers in the Q&A. So I just want to take some time to go through those and maybe pick them apart and see what you think. So I have a laundry list of potential other drivers. So let's maybe start with a few, and I'm sure you'll probably touch on most of them. So in addition to land use activities like logging, could there have been other influences on the incision of the channels that might include just a natural increase in stream flows? So we know climate change is happening. Is there evidence of historic changes or differences in precipitation or discharge that, independent of humans, could produce the response you see?
I may take a stab at this, Will, first, and then you can. This is something we did think about a lot, and indeed, there's clearly rivers that respond to changes that are completely natural climate variability on long timescales. I think for us, the key is the timing, is that it being historical means that we can look at other rivers and know that, from a climatic perspective, there wasn't anything particularly noteworthy. Whereas, other major climate transitions, for example, when we came out of the Ice Age and into the current period, the Holocene, those really profound climate transitions into the Ice Age, out of the Ice Age, are very much recorded by rivers because they upset that balance that we talked about. But I'll leave up to Will today. But mainly it's the timing.
Yeah. So in addition to that, we can fairly confidently rule out any processes that would have applied to the entire landscape as a whole, mostly because of our tributary observations.
Good point.
So if it were climate or something, or like changes in fire frequency or like runoff, anything like that, we would have expected also some incision in the tributaries. And some of the tributaries were incised, but they're usually the bigger ones. So those are the ones that have more power and more ability to incise in response to the main San Lorenzo River incising. But many of the small tributaries were not incised at all. And we would expect that those probably would be if this were a climate variable that caused incision. Yeah.
All right, what about other land use activities that could be associated with logging, but might also be associated with just more humans occupying these watersheds? This could include like road construction, the fact that we have Highway 9 so close to the river channel, the addition of cattle or other livestock that might influence sediment mobilization.
I'm happy to take this, or Will, if you want to take it.
Go for it.
Okay. It's a good question. Road building is one of those things that we commonly associate with sediment going into rivers. So it typically has the opposite sign of what we observed. Cows, definitely in rangeland in the Western United States, is something that they can profoundly change the way that runoff is generated on landscapes. This is something that Margaret works on, not cows specifically, but runoff generation in general. And it's not heavily, the Santa Cruz Mountains are not an area that's heavily ranched. It's just, that's not a land use activity that we know is very common just because of the forestry. So, well, you can go to other landscapes and point to other things. Paving landscapes is another thing that profoundly changes rivers because it generates lots more runoff. And so these are all things that in different landscapes can explain what's going on. Certainly this is not, a universal explanation. It's just that we've tried to drill down in this landscape and be cognizant of what's happened here recently. And so, well, our argument is just somewhat circumstantial. It's sort of, there are a lot of people who've looked at similar things throughout the Western United States, from British Columbia to Southern California.
And there was a big period of road building that led to like increased sediment supply into the San Lorenzo.
You're right. That's a really good point.
In the 70s, I think.
Yep.
But it didn't last terribly long. So it was like a big kind of pulse of sediment, and then, yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges of studying individual watersheds is that they all have their own unique past and unique human influences, and oftentimes there's missing information or documentation, so it's hard to piece all the puzzle pieces together to really truly understand all the potential drivers of channel incision or geomorphology. I think you guys have done a great job of taking some pretty sophisticated tools to bring some of those puzzle pieces together. So speaking of missing documentation, someone asked a question about why do you think we have more information about logging practices in Pescadero Creek than we do for the San Lorenzo River. Does that have something to do with who was doing the documentation, or what type of activities were occurring and where?
That's an excellent question. I would like to just acknowledge by name a guy named Martin Terso, TRSO, who's a consultant in Berkeley, who is really the single person who's responsible for this profound depth of knowledge that we have. And I think it is really a testament just to, so he did this work as part of Pescadero watershed was impaired under the Clean Water Act for fine sediment, and that triggers a regulatory process that results in a thing called a TMDL, and that TMDL, you sort of have to come up with a legally established sediment load for the river. And Martin was responsible for a lot of that work and did a real deep dive into the history of Pescadero. And frankly, I think he did a lot of interviews with people who've lived in that landscape and know a lot about it. So I'm very convinced that if Will and I had more time, and that there are people who know answers to the questions that we're interested in. So if you're in the audience, like
some of you might be here.
Yeah, like, you know, I'm very confident that there are people who know many of the answers to the questions that we're interested in. I scour the historical photo archive in Santa Cruz County because every single picture is kind of a gem. And, you know, there's this incredible history of railroads in the Santa Cruz Mountains. There was a huge flume for a while in the Santa Cruz Mountains on the San Lorenzo River. So there's a lot of things that were going on in rapid succession. So I think the answer to the question is it's really a testament to the scholarship of one person who spent a lot of time working on this problem more than anything else.
Yeah, it is truly amazing what one person can contribute to society and to scientific understanding. So I want to take the last few minutes of our time together to transition more thinking about current impacts on the San Lorenzo River watershed, and even thinking into the future a little bit. So to begin, what effects do you think might climate change or even sea level rise or changes that we know are going to occur that will impact this watershed? How do you think they might impact the future equilibrium or impact the San Lorenzo River?
So in terms of sea level rise, there's an interesting situation that kind of separates the area that we were just talking about from the area downstream of Henry Cowell State Park. And it has to do with the local geology. There's this big block of quartz diorite in the Santa Cruz Mountains that essentially isolates the upper part of that watershed from the ocean. So it's hard for the river to feel the effects of sea level rise up in Henry Cowell State Park, for example, because it's sort of pinned on this really hard to erode block of diorite. Downstream, on the other hand, closer to Santa Cruz, that's where you're going to see a lot of the, you know, kind of more typical thing of what we expect to see, where you have like more of a kind of lagoon complex, you know, basically the tidal effects reaching farther upstream, and more flooding in the kind of lower coastal areas. But I think most of the upper part of the watershed should be relatively unaffected. Yeah.
But to the extent that climate change influences for sort of storminess and things like that, it could easily, you know, I mean, I think this is a question that many of us are really interested in. And I should say that the rest of Will's dissertation is kind of devoted to this question of, in a lot of ways, of how do we think about, in his case, changes in aridity, you know, as rivers start to dry up, how does that influence how they behave? And so to be, not to be annoying about it, but it is sort of very specific to the sort of circumstances you're thinking about.
Yeah, and in line of thinking about, so your work that you presented today is a nice historical look into, what has happened in the past to produce the imprint on landscape we see today. So doing a little bit of a more comparison of now versus then, what do you think are the most important practices in the San Lorenzo River watershed that could influence the future changing of the San Lorenzo River?
I know that the channel is still, for flood prevention, wood is cleared out of the channel. And it makes obvious sense why, right? If I had a house adjacent to the river, I would certainly want people to pull wood out of the river too, because, and so I think in terms of the specific things that we've been talking about, I think that's probably the most direct impact is wood removal that is still, that the city does actively and understandably for flood prevention.
Just to elaborate on that too, like in terms of that being a cause of incision, that was one of the things that I mentioned, removal of wood from channels, because basically you get rid of little sediment storage places on the river and reduce the amount of turbulence of flow and all that. We do know actually from stream gauge data and sediment, well, actually from the actual elevation of the riverbed at the USGS gauge in Henry Cowell, we do know that the riverbed itself is actually fairly stable, despite the fact that they are still removing wood from the channel. So that's kind of an interesting piece, and maybe it suggests that there's something about maybe like the splash damming, if we're still going down the logging hypothesis. So maybe it's like the splash damming that's more important, or the log skidding within the channel, and less so the wood removal. Or maybe it's all of those things together. Maybe wood removal is a problem only when you have also splash damming, because you're getting rid of some of the little sediment reservoirs that protect the stream bed from abrasion, things like that. But anyway.
Right, those compounding problems, it's hard to tease apart often how one thing might work independently from others. So we're nearing the end of our time together. Unfortunately, we only got to a small fraction of the many amazing questions that were put into the Q&A. Hopefully the Q&A is preserved, because I think there's been a lot of really great suggestions and insight. It's clear that the audience tonight has a lot of understanding of the river system that Noah and Will talked about. So hopefully this was fun for everyone to brainstorm together how we think this river system works. So I just want to end on one more, hopefully quick question for Noah and Will that was asked in the Q&A, and that is, what's next? So when we hear from you again at the next university forum about local geomorphology or river problems, what are you going to tell us about?
So I'm really interested in local rivers. I've done a lot of work in a lot of different local rivers. One thing that Will is not going to get to in his dissertation, but we talked about it at one point, that I'm very interested in is kind of there's a lot of historic gullying that you see, particularly north of Santa Cruz, that I'm very interested in understanding more about. So another example of something related to land use decisions that have tipped the balance and caused the landscape to change in a pretty dramatic way. But we'll see. You got to stay tuned, I guess. So.
All right, we'll stay tuned. Okay, well, thank you all so much for joining tonight. I invite you to join us next week for our final CRA lecture of the year. And we'll have Assistant Professor of Astronomy and Astrophysics, Professor Rebecca Jensen-Clem, who will come speak. You can register by clicking on the link in the chat or by visiting the UC Santa Cruz events page. Unfortunately, this is the last university forum talk of the year, so we look forward to seeing you all back in the fall for more enjoyable and exciting forum conversations. So thank you and have a good night.